So beautiful community. This is going to be the next UK Prime Minister, and I'm going to try to sum everything up for us in under 15 minutes, knowing we're also an international audience. About 15% of us are from the UK. Now, this was a huge defeat in Makerfield for Reform UK, the ex-conservative, anti-constitutional populist party. And we're going to say something about whether that means reform is or isn't in decline. But let's start with the basics. This is a huge by-election victory for Andy Burnham, far exceeding expectations, and the performance of reform falling far below expectations. Keir Starmer, the current Prime Minister, is now a lame duck, and it's just a question of how and when he goes. So Andy Burnham is realistically, unless he goes into a monastery or develops a health challenge, is going to be the next UK Prime Minister.
The word Makerfield in the future must be known as a byword for the change that came to British politics. This is the moment. We've been on a path for 40 years that simply hasn't worked for people and places in this part of the world, and this now is the change moment. We have an opportunity to turn the tide, to make the country feel like it's working again, to make people see that politics can make a positive difference, to make people feel hope again. That is the main thing I think we need in this country right now, for people to feel a sense of hope.
So, Keir Starmer is absolutely furious about this. Why is Keir Starmer furious? Because of the same thing that made Joe Biden furious about being pushed away from running for a second term. It's a kind of distortion of reality that power enacts upon people who outside of politics have good imagination and integrity. Joe Biden has profound integrity outside politics. If he met me twice, he'd check on my illness 18 months later. I wonder how Vlad is struggling. So Joe Biden is very beautiful outside of politics, but it was unethical for him to run in 2020 because he was already beginning to suffer cognitive decline, and he got lucky through the pandemic, without which he probably would have lost to Trump. But then, despite a lot of private pushback, he wanted to run for a second term. And that's because he felt, I've been building up to this all my life. I'm finally here. I've done some things that I regard as very good. I defeated Trump. This is my lane. Don't let anybody come and kick me out of it. And that makes sense. And unfortunately, it also made sense to Jill Biden, but it's a distortion. It's a distortion that power does to you. And you should resist it, but it's incredibly difficult because it takes enormous imaginative self-extraction. Keir Starmer is the same. I rebuilt the Labour Party. I fought a leadership campaign. I won a general election with a massive mandate. In the UK, you can have a huge majority or suffer a huge defeat in the Commons at the level of number of seats you get, without that necessarily reflecting a big gap in the votes between the parties. So it can create a kind of mirage of collapse or dominance, right? Famously, in 1906, there was an apocalyptic wipeout of the Tories at the level of seats in Parliament. They got something like 150, and Henry Campbell Bannerman got something like 400. But the difference between the parties, between the Tories and the Liberal Party in votes in 1906 was 49-43, right? So this kind of artificial, but significant, but artificial majority that Labour has. And Keir Starmer says, this is my mandate. Why is this chap from Manchester coming in and pushing me out when I am the steady hand that the country needs and that the country elected with a huge majority only 2 years ago? So Keir Starmer is finding it almost unintelligible what's going on. obviously this is my lane. Why are people trying to kick me out of it, right? But from the big picture perspective, what do you see? You see that it is absolutely rational for Labour members of Parliament to understand that Starmer could never beat Farage, that they could never win a general election with this leader, and that this leader has lost the trust of the country. Alistair Campbell said something unsurprising but remarkable this morning, that a lot of people who've benefited from the policies of Keir Starmer's government don't know it, because that's how bad the communication of this government has been. Keir Starmer has not just been bad at communicating with the country, he's been bad at grasping the special importance of communication in a historical moment that's a crisis of trust, which is really as bad as putting on a wine tasting without any glasses, without any stemware. It's no good then that you point out you had some nice wines, right? Where are you going to drink them out of? A mug? So, by the way, wine tastes completely different depending on what vessel it's in. So that's a problem. And Labour members of Parliament are privately saying, we are going down with Keir Starmer. It doesn't mean we're going to go up with Andy Burnham, but we're going down with Keir Starmer. And so we're done with this. We're done with this. It's just a matter of when and how the party changes leader. What's going to be good for the country? What's going to be good for the country is that Keir Starmer doesn't try to compete for his position, right? We're watching the World Cup. Well, I'm unfortunately not watching it. I haven't done a full match yet for health reasons because I have so little time. But the World Cup is happening, and we know that it doesn't matter what you got up to over the past 3 years. If you've lost the trust of the players and they're consistently failing to perform and consistently failing to implement your system, you're out as a coach. You're just out. It can't be, but I put in so much work and I built this process over 4 years. No, I'm sorry. If it's not working, it's not working. That's politics. But when you're inside, you can have this sort of collapse of ethical and imaginative self-extraction that Keir Starmer is earnestly but delusionally suffering from now. So what you want is Keir Starmer not to compete for his position, but you do want others to challenge Andy Burnham, so there's a semblance of participatory, competitive democracy. We learned the lesson from what happened with Kamala Harris. It looked too much like a sort of insufficiency of participatory democracy, the transition from Biden to her. It felt a bit coup-like, right? Not because there was anything illegitimate that was happening, but because the lack of competition generated an understandable, right, absence of perception of legitimacy. Then the question arises, should there be a general election? And the problem is that Labour have such a big majority that the incentive for the next Labour leader is to try to keep it without having an election. But if Andy Burnham were bold, then he would try to have an election. What would this require? It would require him saying clearly, this is my picture of a national project. It's different to the Labour manifesto, so we need to have an election. And because I've communicated so clearly with the country, I'm going to win it. And so here I go, and here I win the election in 2027. So whether it'll happen depends on whether Burnham is A, successful, and B, bold, to related things. So how has he got here? How has he essentially become the next prime minister just by winning a by-election? There are two distinct aspects to his message, even though his program is completely vague at the moment across many, many important questions. But there are two key things he did. Number one, he said Westminster national politics is broken. But it doesn't mean that institutions are broken irreversibly and need to be torn apart. So he is a constitutional politician. He is not like Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage is anti-constitutional. He's out to break the democratic game. And somebody might say, Vlad, how do you know? He's not been in power. Well, Trump, you could argue, is breaking the democratic game. How do you know that about Nigel? You can't know it, Vlad. You can't know it until he comes to power and we see what he's going to do. That's the sort of thing a lot of people would say. It's wrong, right? I won't argue for it now, but how you get to that knowledge is by assessing what Farage is as a political operator, his entrepreneurial attitudes, and his lack of a sense of responsibility. And then you add to that the way he will inevitably be pulled and pushed by various political forces once in power. Right? And the combination of the two lands you clearly in the conclusion that this is a guy who overwhelmingly will prioritize career over the sustenance of democracy. But Burnham is constitutional, but he is saying that in some ways we've got a crisis, we've got a political crisis of legitimacy. And that's important. Why is it important? It's important to say it in a responsible, pro-institutional way, the way Mamdani is saying it. Doesn't mean you have to agree with his policies, but in broad parameters, Mamdani is not anti-institutional, but he is saying there's a crisis of legitimacy. The way you do it, the reason it's so important to do it is that you don't contaminate citizens with this inappropriate normalization that they're constantly receiving from centrist technocratic politicians, right? And unfortunately, that's what they're receiving from Keir Starmer. They're saying, we feel there's a political crisis, and Keir is saying, I am leading on the international stage, and domestically I am doing that, and then this, and then that, and then this. And so we're on track to renew. No, Keir, we're not on track. We're freaking out and we're scared. And the implication of Keir's actions is you are scared, but it's irrational for you to be scared. Burnham's position is it's rational for you to be scared because there is a political crisis, right? And we've reached some kind of cul-de-sac, some kind of impasse, and we've got to deal with it. Doesn't mean we break the democratic game, but we've got to deal with it. The second message that I haven't conceptualized yet that I think political leaders need to add here, but it's very difficult to put into the right words, is to acknowledge that there's then a further sense of crisis that politics can't do anything about or can't do much about. And that's just the crisis of being a human being in the modern world. But for that, you need a special language that says, look, in the modern world, it's actually impossible for anybody to feel truly at home. In the modern world, human beings are going to feel a very great deal of alienation. Right? The exceptions who won't are those who have a lot of talent and are immensely fulfilled by the realization of that talent. That's not going to be most humans. So you've got to find a political way of communicating what in a completely non-politically available way my hero Bernard Williams said in his book Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy over 40 years ago, when he said no life for a modern human being can be entirely satisfactory. The second pillar of what Burnham has done is that he has not attacked Farage's voters in the way a lot of centrist technocrats attack them for being unethical or immoral or ignorant. And he has avoided culture wars and is focused on issues that have the potential to bring people on both sides of the Brexit divide together. Issues of economic exclusion, issues that are, going to be articulable on the doorstep independently of any kind of move in the culture war or where you voted for Brexit. So that's good, but that does not amount to anything like a set of concrete policy proposals or anything like a political project. So that's a good start to generate political success. That in itself absolutely does not translate into readiness to run the country, right? So if that's all Andy Burnham is going to do, he's going to crash and burn very quickly as Prime Minister. Now, does what we've seen mean that Reform are in trouble? Because they did exceptionally badly, and I've run over 15 minutes. We're going to finish under 20 minutes now. And the answer here is twofold. First, remember the principle that when a particular authoritarian ex-conservative project lapses, it doesn't mean that that tendency itself lapses, right? You don't have a renormalization of politics just because Trumpism implodes. You get the distinction. Too many times people miss it. People look at Trump and think that Trumpism is going to fail and they celebrate. But Trumpism is just an early manifestation of a trend that's going to magnify in the 2030s. That's the first thing to understand, right? Even if Farage disappeared tomorrow, the trend wouldn't. Then on the particular question of Reform under Farage, I think a lot will depend on the degree of divisiveness on the so-called center-right and on the so-called center-left. So if there's a fairly low degree of divisiveness on the center-left, it's going to be harder for Farage to win. And if there's a great degree of divisiveness on the right with the Conservatives and with the post-conservative parties, Restore UK and Reform UK, then Farage is going to have a harder time. And he's already pretty angry that something like 6% of his potential votes went to Restore in Makerfield. Forgot, final question. Forgot. Will Andy Burnham succeed? That is a distinction between difficulty and difficulty. On the one hand, Nigel Farage and Donald Trump are not difficult to beat. A 5 out of 10 Democrat candidate would have beaten Trump. Trump is there because his victory is a product of incapacity on the other side that was so extreme that it allowed his combination of extreme talent in some respect and spectacular unfitness for office in most respects to get him over the line. A 5 out of 10 performance beats Trump. A 5 to 6, I would say 6 out of 10 performance beats Nigel Farage. But that's just to say that it's not difficult for some people, but it might still be difficult for others. It's very difficult for a centrist technocratic political party to turn about like that. Therefore, what I wrote a few years back when Sunak became Prime Minister, I said that his government will fail, he'll be replaced by Labour, Labour will fail, we might try a few new things like electoral reform, but then authoritarians will circle power. That's still the trajectory, unless or until somebody like Andy Burnham is able to show us something they haven't shown us yet. Lots of love.